Okay. Uh, Thank you for joining us for our JINSA policy webinar. I want to start by thanking my colleague Blaise Mistel for helping to organize today's Zoom. With that, I would again like to thank all of you for joining us. We are excited to have joining us today Dr. Galia Lindenstrauss, Dr. Celine Nasi, and Alan Makovsky. Dr. Lindenstrauss is a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies. Dr. Nasi is a noted journalist with Carrara newspaper, and this discussion will be moderated by Alan Makovsky, member of JINSA's Eastern Mediterranean Policy Project, and is a senior fellow for national security and international policy at the Center for American Progress. Our esteemed panelists will be discussing Turkey-Israel relations, reset, rhetoric, or rivalry. During the webinar, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on your screen. For those in the audience, you're automatically muted and your video is off. I would like to invite Alan to start the discussion.
Thanks so much, Harris. It's good to be back on the JINSA airwaves. The title of our session is Turkey-Israel Relations, Reset, Rhetoric, or Rivalry. I'll give a very brief introduction to the topic. The decision to hold this panel was prompted by a recent series of suggestions, formal and informal, coming from the Turkish side, suggesting that a reset of bilateral Israeli-Turkish relations, including the return of ambassadors, could be possible and even imminent. Many of you are familiar with the broad trajectory of Turkish-Israeli diplomatic ties. Turkey recognized Israel in 1949, the only Muslim majority state to do so until Egypt did under its peace treaty with Israel in 1979, 30 years after Turkey. Bilateral ties particularly flourished throughout the 1990s, but began to decline with the ascension to power of Erdogan's AK Party in 2002, first gradually, then precipitously, and reaching a nadir with the famous Mavi Marmara incident in 2010 when 10 Turkish citizens were killed. Since that time, there have been halting efforts at reviving ties, but with minimal success. Today, both states are represented in one another's capitals by low-level diplomats. Turkey and Israel are the two most powerful states in the Middle East. Turkey is in NATO and Israel is unequivocally pro-US and pro-Western, and yet relations between the two have been very rocky in recent years, and for a number of years. To sort all this out and explore the outlook for Turkish-Israeli relations, including whether there could be a positive reset, as Harris introduced, I just want to clarify who Galia and Celine are. We have a leading Turkish scholar, Celine, and a leading Israeli scholar, Galia, both of whom are specialists in Turkish-Israeli relations. I just want to say, as someone who has followed this issue for many, many years, I can tell you there are a lot of people who write about it, but these two you won't find better. So I follow what they write very closely and learn a lot from it. And I know you will too over the next hour. So I'll just maybe mention that Dr. Nasi is a newly minted PhD who did her dissertation on Turkish-Israeli relations, and Galia Lindenstrauss is a fellow at Israel's prestigious Institute for National Security Studies and is working on a book on Turkish-Israeli relations. So I'm looking forward to a great discussion. I've asked both speakers to speak initially for up to 10 minutes. I'll follow up with a question or two and leave plenty of time for audience Q&A. Let me start with these questions to both of you. There's a general impression that Turkey wants the reset, but Israel really doesn't. Is that the correct way to look at what's going on now? And why would Turkey want it after so many years of hostility? We'll start with Dr. Nasi and then go to Dr. Lindenstrauss. Celine, the floor is yours.
I would like to thank you, Ellen, for your beautiful introduction, flattering introduction. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you today. I believe there is a window of opportunity for a reset, but progress very much depends on how the Turkish government will adapt. I will try to explain why. There has been an ongoing debate that the time has come for Turkey to mend ties with the countries in the region, including Israel, so as to strengthen its hand geopolitically. Of course, recent developments have put more pressure on Ankara in this regard. The on and off tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean, Biden's imminent inauguration, the US Congress decision to impose sanctions on Turkey over its purchase of S-400s. And then came the EU's preparations for new sanctions. And we can also add to that Turkey's fragile economy, which badly needs foreign investment. All of these have surely accelerated Ankara's demand for a diplomatic opening. In the light of these developments, statements came from the Turkish officials, high-level officials, in favor of establishing cordial relations, not only with Israel, but also with the United States and the European Union. My interpretation is that Ankara is testing the waters for a possible reset in foreign policy. Likewise, Ankara's normalization efforts with Israel might indicate a shift toward a more realist foreign policy with more balanced relations with the West. However, Ankara's overtures, like you said, have met with skepticism in Israel, to put it nicely. And that's primarily because Ankara has been sending mixed signals to Jerusalem. Remember, last May, the hearty exchange of messages during the COVID-19 pandemic raised expectations that the two countries might finally get their diplomatic relations back on track and exchange ambassadors. But in midsummer, on the day the Hagia Sophia Museum reopened as a mosque, Turkey's Directorate of Communications shared a video which included images of Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. Well, the subtext was obviously Turkey's liberation of Jerusalem, or so it was perceived. Fast forward toward the end of 2020, we learned from Amber'in Zaman's reporting that the two sides talks for a possible reconciliation had indeed been had continued at the intelligence level, and Ankara was preparing to appoint set of foundations foreign policy director Ufuk Ulutaş as its new envoy to Jerusalem. To my knowledge, his appointment has not been confirmed by Turkish authorities yet. However, Ankara's choice of a controversial figure who lacks diplomatic experience, as is known for his anti-Israeli views, understandably prompted criticism from Israel. I mean, it is confusing even if you're not an outsider. One of the president's advisors penned an article arguing that the Gulf countries, telling the Gulf countries that Turkey, rather than Israel, would come to their aid if Iran ever attacked. At around the same time, another advisor suggested in an interview that Turkey might reinvigorate the Turkish-Israeli defense relationship, defense cooperation of the 1990s, and was open to purchasing arms from Israel. I mean, what should we make of these contradictory statements? Which brings us to the question, how sincere is Turkey in seeking a reset with Israel? As I mentioned before, geopolitical imperatives have long been pushing Turkey for restoring ties with Israel. Ankara didn't pay enough attention to the things that were happening right under its nose, partly because of its it was focusing inordinately on Syria, and partly because maybe it overestimated its own strength. However, it missed out on some big things in the neighborhood. The case in point is, of course, the East Med Gas Forum. The informal energy cooperation initiated in the wake of the Mavi Marmara developed into a strategic alliance that ultimately excluded Turkey. And Ankara, I think, is also aware that pursuing an identity-based foreign policy has become a burden in many aspects and has reached its limits. It is true, Turkey still aspires to be the leader of the Sunni Muslim world, and in this context, it positions itself as the champion of the Palestinian cause. But we all know that rolling back Iran's regional power has increasingly overshadowed the Palestinian issue, especially in the post-Arab Spring Middle East. As a matter of fact, the Arab world only tepidly responded to the US President Donald Trump's pro-Israeli decisions. In the wake of the Abraham Accords, the Palestinian Authority even failed to pass a resolution to condemn the UAE's deal with Israel. I mean, it's ironic. Turkey repeatedly underlines that the Palestinian issue is its red line. However, regardless of Ankara's moral ground, let's accept that, this red line policy has yielded little to no practical outcome. Besides, history shows that Turkey is able to play a more constructive role when it maintains cordial relations with Israel. Also, in hindsight, I think Turkey's support for the Muslim Brotherhood also proved costly, undermining its relations with undermining its relations with Saudi Arabia and Egypt and other Gulf countries, and resulting in regional isolation. So in this respect, this recent reconciliation between Qatar and the Saudi-led bloc, in my point of view, will have important repercussions, including Turkey's relations with Qatar. At the very least, the lifting of the blockade is very likely to reduce Qatar's dependence on Turkey. Of course, we do not know yet what concessions Qatar made for this reconciliation. And I don't expect Qatar to renounce its ties with Turkey, who stood by it in difficult times. However, downgrading support for the Muslim Brotherhood seems like a more plausible scenario to me, which will put considerable pressure on Ankara's relations, the AK Party's relations with the Muslim Brotherhood. Galia previously said in an interview, and I totally agree with her, Israel does not object to Turkey's having ties with the Muslim Brotherhood. But what Israel objects is the fact that Turkey has been turning a blind eye to Hamas' use of its territory as a base for planning attacks on Israel. But with some legal changes, perhaps Turkey can allay one of Israel's biggest worries and pave the way for a better relationship. From this perspective, we can expect some mild changes in Turkish foreign policy. It is too early to say when, but it is likely, and there may come a point in which interests will outweigh ideological preferences. But of course, there are obstacles. One thing Turkey hasn't figured out yet is the fact that Turkey is no longer an indispensable partner for Israel. Jerusalem won't move a muscle until it sees concrete steps, convincing steps from Ankara. The second thing is Israelis are heading to the polls once again, and I'm sure Galia will elaborate more on that. But Israel's domestic political environment is not particularly conducive to Ankara's normalization efforts. And before closing, I would like to add one more thing. One has to distinguish between a genuine normalization and a merely resumption of diplomatic representation. To me, exchanging ambassadors is, in fact, a technical matter. As you said in the opening, Ellen, Turkey recalled its envoy, but it did not officially downgrade diplomatic representation in 2018. So that's why it's a technical matter. Whereas a genuine normalization requires restoration of mutual trust. We need to see mutual actions from both sides that will go beyond declarations of intent. And for this to happen, this should be supported by a stable and gradual restoration process. The two countries need to redefine their relations on the basis of common geopolitical interests and downplay their ideological preferences. Without trust, it is absurd to expect Israel to lobby on behalf of Turkey, or that the two would sign arms deals. And I'm not even talking about agreements that would endanger Israel's ties with other countries that it worked so hard to cultivate. So much ultimately depends on whether Ankara is really willing to take a step toward a strategic reorientation. Thank you.
Great.
The ball is on your court.
Thank you very much. Those other countries you're talking about that Israel worked so hard to cultivate relations, I think you mean Greece and Cyprus, especially, right? So let me turn now to Dr. Lyndon Strauss. And since I know both of the speakers personally, I think this will be the last time that I will use titles and last name.
So thank you very much. Thank you for Blaise for organizing the event, and for Jinsa for hosting the event. And it's really, I have great respect to Celine and Alan, so it's really an honor to be with them on the same panel. I will echo some of the things Celine says, but that's just because she says such wise things. I must say that the response in Israel to the Turkish overtures was rather muted. It did receive some press coverage, but in the government level, almost no reference to it. Just the foreign minister said they would inquire the issue. I think that despite the positive nature of the Turkish overtures, they were, as Celine mentioned, they were received with suspicion in Jerusalem. They were seen mainly as meant to drive a wedge between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece in light of the growing and heightening tensions in the East Mediterranean. And also because of the choice of the envoy, and in general because of Turkish greater involvement in Eastern Jerusalem over the years, and in general among Israeli Palestinians, it was also seen as suspicion that basically Turkey needs this direct access to Israel, and it's good to have the ambassador there to open doors, and that's why it's doing it, to have more influence among in East Jerusalem. So it was seen with a lot of suspicion. Obviously, again, if you look at the Israeli response, it seems that there's no urgency in bringing back the ambassadors. On the contrary, I think Jerusalem is trying to adopt a wait-and-see approach to see how Turkish foreign policy develops in general. As Sabine says, is it really a reset, or is it something else? Because 2020 was a year filled with very assertive and even we can even say provocative Turkish actions. Now, we have to see if 2020 was an exception, that Israel was using the pandemic and everyone was busy in their domestic affairs, so they were turning a blind eye to some of the Turkish activity, whether because of Trump's last year of office, Turkey was getting away with things it wouldn't get away in a normal US administration. But definitely 2020 was a year in which Turkey's assertiveness was very clear. And we have to see whether this is exception or this is the rule, because if Turkey continues with these assertive and provocative actions, especially against Greece and Cyprus, it would be very hard for Israel to have the ambassadors back and have normal diplomatic relations. If, on the other hand, this charm offensive Turkey is now having will have results, and Turkey is sincere about it, then that makes also the reset with Israel more plausible. There also seems to be a sense in Jerusalem that just bringing back the ambassadors is not enough. That Turkey has to do another goodwill gesture, something to prove its seriousness. And I think, as Celine mentioned, that doing something against Hamas military activities on Turkish soil, it's enabling Hamas operatives to basically the granting of citizenship, for example, and the fact that basically Hamas operatives can plan terrorist attacks against the West Bank and Israel on Turkey. I think if Turkey does something about that, that might be some sign of seriousness. Of course, Israel has already received promises on this issue in the past, and some things did change, but then some things reappeared, these activities reappeared. But this is somewhere, I think, where Turkey can show its goodwill. And I'm not sure it's also in Turkey's interest to have these Hamas operatives operating the way they do on Turkish soil. So I think this is where Turkey can show its seriousness. So now, if I look at the Israeli response now in 2020, the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021, to the Turkish overtures, and I compare this to how Israel acted in 2013 when Netanyahu apologized to Erdogan, and in 2016 when they signed the normalization agreement with Turkey, and Israel also paid compensation to Turkey. Why now this indifference? And then, and if you compare it to the past, where Israel did want to move forward with Turkey. So I think there are a few issues that can explain this difference between 2020 and 2016. The most obvious is the issue of mistrust. This is a relationship that already got bruised too many times. So it's difficult to turn a new page. The mistrust is very strong. And as I said, Turkey has to show its seriousness. But the more deep cause, which again Celine referred to, is the new regional context, and specifically the Abraham Accords, which is both giving Israel more self-confidence, and also it is pushing it away from Turkey, both because of positive reasons. The cooperation today between Israel and the UAE resembles in many respects some of the cooperation Israel used to have with Turkey in the 1990s, but also because suspicion toward Turkey is also a glue to this new relationship Israel has with these Gulf countries. And another issue why I think 2020 is different than 2016 is the issue of Greece and Cyprus. Now, it's true that Israel's looming relations with Greece and Cyprus also factored in Israel's considerations when it signed the agreement with Turkey in 2016. But today, this relationship is much stronger. And as mentioned, it has concrete manifestations. The East Med gas forum, which Celine mentioned, in which Turkey is not a member to, the East Med pipeline, which Turkey objects and is trying to sabotage, and also the tensions in the East Med are now much worse. And hence, it's harder to balance Israel's relations with Greece and Cyprus with its relations with Turkey, as it was perhaps in 2016. And related to this point also, in 2016, there was still the issue of the natural gas that was pushing both sides to explore the relations between them. This time around, I don't see Israel even playing again with the notion of a pipeline to Turkey. I think that's gone under the bridge. It's no longer something that Israel is considering. So we don't have this that was pushing the normalization agreement in 2016. So I will sum by saying that I think the return of the ambassadors, as Celine said, it's a technical issue. It might happen in 2021. It might be even a unilateral Turkish action. As Celine said, relations were not downgraded. They can even bring back the ambassador and not expect reciprocity, immediate reciprocity on the side of Israel. However, returning the ambassadors doesn't mean a significant change for the better in Turkish-Israeli relations, because these countries have drifted apart, both in the bilateral level, but also in the regional level. They have gone to different directions, which makes it very hard for them to turn a new page. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both. Those are two really terrific analyses that I think were very penetrating, and there's a lot of agreement there. Let me flip the question a little bit to both of you. Imagine that this doesn't work out. I mean, you're both were pretty skeptical. You both said even if the ambassador returns, it doesn't mean a lot if there aren't other agreements attached to it. How bad could things get? What is the worst that could happen in Turkish-Israeli relations in the next 12 to 18 months? I'll start with either of you, maybe just to stay in the same order. Celine, could
Okay.
you speculate on that a bit? And, you know, I realize I'm asking you to crystal ball gaze here. So.
Yeah, I mean, historically, the two countries avoided engaging in direct confrontation. So I don't expect the bilateral relations to deteriorate even to a worse
Even worse.
level. Yeah, but I can say that it will be in the benefit of other actors in the region too, if these two countries eventually restore their relations. Because with NATO's second largest army, Turkey has shown that its military engagement could shift balances in Syria, in Libya, and recently in Nagorno-Karabakh. There are, of course, questions to whether Turkey can, continue this strategy. I mean, fighting on several fronts, but facing a severe economic condition at home, etc. And many also worry that Turkey's growing assertiveness is an evidence of its expansionism. I must say I find that portrayal a little bit hypocritical, because Turkey is not the only country in the region seeking power projection. It's natural that local actors are trying to, fill in the power vacuum when we're going through a global power transition. But when you look at outcomes, Ankara's military presence, be it in Syria, in Libya, or Azerbaijan, does not necessarily undermine American interests either. On the contrary, it offers a counterweight to Russia. So at a time when America is perhaps seeking to spend minimal resources and retreating to an offshore balancing role, Turkey could play a key role in the region in terms of balancing Iran, Russia, and China if Ankara and Washington overcome their problems. And in this, normalization between Turkey and Israel could pave the way for improved relations with other countries of the region, between Turkey and other countries. And of course, this would dial down the tension in the region and contribute to regional security. So I flipped your question again.
Okay, no, that's just fine. And Galia, same question. I mean, have we hit the floor of how bad things get? Let's say Turkey gets the message that Israel, isn't really that interested in this reset unless Turkey does things that it's not willing to do, such as end ties with Hamas, for example. Have we hit the floor or could things actually get worse between Turkey and Israel?
Well, I think as we see in the pandemic, things can always get worse. But hopefully, I mean, I agree with Celine that both these countries have their share of enemies, and they really don't need each other as another enemy state. So we don't want to go this direction, and hopefully we will maintain this persistent rivalry and not deteriorate further. I don't think in the short term we will have a confrontation, but if one would imagine a confrontation, it will probably be in the East Mediterranean, as we had already witnessed in some degree in the flotilla, and also in a much lesser degree. But there was a research ship, an Israeli research ship, that went to the Cypriot EZ with the permission of Cyprus, and the Turkish Navy basically made it go home. So that was a very small confrontation, but it does give a taste to what can happen. So I mean, I don't see a major confrontation ahead, and hopefully we will not get to it. But if it will be, it will probably be some sort of a naval confrontation. But again, one of the good things, by the way, that since the flotilla incidents, we didn't have a major confrontations with casualties between them. So that's the good. With all the bad things that happened, with all the harsh rhetoric of Erdogan, and the rhetorical battles between Netanyahu and Erdogan, it remained in the rhetorical level. So that's actually encouraging news, I think.
I
would like to add something.
Sure.
One thing we haven't discussed yet, and it's related to what Galia already brought up with regard to the Abraham Accords and its regional implications. Turkey always boasts of its strong trade relations with Israel, and it continues to amaze people how this was, possible, insulating economic relations from political crisis, so on and so forth. I think in the long run, Turkey is unfortunately is going to lose its share in trade with Israel. Also, this is going to be the case in tourism as well, because now that Israel has other countries to do trade, and in just last Hanukkah, Israeli tourists flocked to the UAE, sorry. Yeah, and it's only natural, and it's just starting. From now on, we are going to see more of this. And so Turkey will lose its advantage and leverage, perhaps, vis-a-vis Israel.
Interesting point. Shalin, also you brought up Azerbaijan. I just wanted to actually, again, ask both of you briefly. I mean, much was made in the media about the fact that Azerbaijan fought its recent war in Nagorno-Karabakh using weaponry, particularly armed drones, from both Israel and from Turkey. It seemed to me diplomatically, Israel tried to stay out of it as much as possible, correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of equipment, they were on the same side. You could also find, I think you could say that Turkey has certain uneasiness about Iran, particularly Iran's presence in Syria. Perhaps its uneasiness about Iran isn't as great as Israel's uneasiness, but I just wonder, could any of these issues be the basis of, particularly these two issues, be the basis of bringing the two sides closer together? I'll start with Galia. She'll hand this one.
So I think definitely what happened in Azerbaijan reminded to many the good old days in the 1990s, in which really Turkey and Israel cooperated, and this was to the benefit of both countries, because as you mentioned, Turkey definitely pushed Azerbaijan for this round of violence, which was a spectacular victory from the Azerbaijani perspective. It was like the Six-Day War in having a very decisive outcome. Israel, as you mentioned, tried to stay diplomatically out, but Azerbaijan has bought Israeli weapons over the years, and definitely they have proven themselves in the battlefield. So they were definitely on the both. So they were on the same side in this respect. I do, however, think that the growing influence of Turkey in Azerbaijan, and also the Russian peacekeeping force, this probably actually will make it more difficult for Israel to maintain the relationship with Azerbaijan in the level it was before. So in this respect, there might be even a sort of in the longer run, there might be actually not a major conflict of interest between Turkey and Israel, but there will be, I think, some problematic aspects with that. As you mentioned, with regard to Iran, well, of course, both are uneasy, for example, from the Iranian nuclear program. For Israel, it's an existential threat. Turkey sees it very differently. It doesn't see the Iranian nuclear weapons as first directed against it. It might use it I mean, if Iran does manage to break out and advance in its military nuclear program, that might be also an incentive for Turkey to go in this path in the longer run.
Shalin?
Well, it is an interesting point that Turkey and Israel still has overlapping interests in terms of balancing Iran in the region. And when it comes to Syria, they have similar interests, but not overlapping threat perceptions. As Galia brought up already, Iran is an existential threat for Israel, whereas for Turkey, while they're historically rivals, they're also neighbors. So Turkey will always avoid to directly confront Iran. But on the other hand, I am pretty sure that Ankara is uncomfortable with having a nuclear Iran, sharing a border with a nuclear Iran. So they have interests. And it is also interesting that these two countries have cooperated without coordination in Syria. I mean, they supported the same side. maybe sometime we will find out the details of this cooperation, but as of now, we do not know whether it was coordinated or not. But anyway, it is what is important that these two countries have a potential to cooperate, and that potential is not being used now. It's going to waste at the moment, I can say.
Thank you. Galia, just quick follow-up on that. A few months ago, I think it was the Times of London quoted Yossi Cohen, who was then the head of Mossad, as having, a couple of years previous, having told his counterparts from the Gulf that Turkey was actually a bigger threat than Iran. And I just, I doubt that Yossi Cohen confided in you exactly what he meant by that. And but I just wondered, do you have any interpretation? How do you understand that? Obviously, Iran's always been seen as an existential threat, potentially, if it gets nuclear arms, as an existential threat to Israel, whereas Turkey is, let's say, by comparison, a problem. How should we understand that Cohen statement, or is it, or should we just not, or should we disregard it? Because actually, of course, it wasn't an on-the-record statement. It was something that was reported.
I mean, I think there is consensus about in the security establishment that Iran is the major problem is not only in its nuclear program, but also in support of Hezbollah, which is a very, very immediate threat to Israel. So I think that there is a consensus about this issue. There is, however, a sense of uneasiness about Turkey's actions in the Middle East. Where do they want? What is their end game? And this uneasiness is not only in Israel; it's shared among many countries in the Middle East. And I think there's also the Abraham Accord, the growing cooperation, then they're echoing each other, and they're hearing everybody's complaining about Turkey, and it makes it feel like Turkey is a big nuisance. Turkish policy is a big nuisance to many countries in the region. And I think that's where that's the danger to Turkey. If you annoy too many actors in the international system, they will respond, and I think that's where the mistake is. But basically, there's this uneasiness about what Turkey wants. What does it want? And because there's no good answers yet to that, or there's still the understanding is still flawed. I think that's where the concern arises.
So then let me turn to Turkish domestic politics for a second. You mentioned the video at the time when the Turkish government had declared Hagia Sophia a mosque rather than a museum. The video that was issued that showed, El Aqsa, and of course Erdogan made a statement around that time that, talking about how the Ottoman military left Jerusalem in tears, and Jerusalem is ours, Jerusalem is from us. To what extent is Israel really and maybe I'll add just one more datum to that. We constantly see in polls how that from Turkey that Israel is seen as a threat, and is really, the least liked or most disliked. I see the most recent Metro poll. They asked a series of countries. They asked Turks about a series of countries, friend or foe, and Israel, 74% of Turks said foe, 4% said friend. How should we understand the role that Israel plays in Turkish domestic policy, and particularly the way Erdogan plays off of that?
Yeah, to start with, I've always been a strong advocate of linkage politics. To me, the distinction between foreign and domestic policy has always been artificial. But to the degree to which foreign policy decisions are made, taking into consideration domestic concerns, depends on the strength of political institutions and the checks and balances in the system. That applies to Turkey as well. With the erosion of traditional checks and balances, I think foreign policy decisions are made more susceptible to both domestic concerns and political ideological preferences of the political elites. When I look at Turkish-Israeli relations during the AK Party period, I can say that Ankara has adopted an increasingly defiant tone towards Israel, starting from the Davos summit of 2009. It was because the AK Party government became confident and powerful enough at home and abroad that it could let go of alliance ties once it deemed essential to remain in power. However, back in those times, the AK Party's popularity stemmed from its Muslim identity as much as its political and economic strength. Things have changed dramatically since then. As I already mentioned, the Palestinian issue is no longer on the top of the international agenda. Defying Israel may still be instrumental in terms of galvanizing domestic support, but opinion polls suggest that it only provides a temporary relief. Soon, voters turn their focus back to the real problems facing the country, such as the inflation or the unemployment. Besides, the strategic cost of Turkey's regional isolation has reached a point that now it threatens the government's popularity, having already narrowed its capacity to maneuver in foreign policy. There is almost a consensus among the political parties that Turkey should mend fences with its neighbors, even though they may differ on how this reconciliation may occur. There is also a group of nationalists who advocate that Turkey should follow an independent, quote unquote, independent foreign policy, referring to a more Eurasianist approach. But at the same time, as articles from the military authorities who also advance this blue homeland doctrine indicate, there are some in armed forces who advocate support Turkey's rapprochement both with Egypt and Israel. Of course, government's criticism reached such a point that it's not easy to backtrack so quickly. I mean, even if Ankara, let's say, eventually revamps its ties with the Muslim Brotherhood and initiates a thaw with Israel, it will be at pains to avoid appearing to have made a concession. Domestic political considerations certainly cause complications, so complicates foreign policy making. And one thing I noticed, and Ankara should bear in mind if really it wants to reduce inconsistency, and that is that when you give a message to domestic audience, it is also monitored by the international community.
These days you can't speak only to the audience you want to speak to, right? You're speaking to the world. Thank you. That was a very complete answer. We have a couple of audience questions. The first one is to all of us, including one to me, about the United States. Dr. Nassi, how much is Ankara's suggestion that it's interested in a reset motivated by a desire to improve relations with the US? It's something you touched on, but perhaps you want to elaborate. And Dr. Lindenstrauss, does the US-Turkish relationship and its problems figure at all in how Jerusalem might respond to Ankara? And the question to me is, how is the Biden administration likely to approach Turkey, and would improved Turkish-Israeli ties change that approach in any meaningful way?
Yeah, I already touched upon some of them, but I will start again. I mean, the regional security environment has been undergoing a major change. Significant developments have been taking place in the Middle East recently, starting with the Abraham Accords last summer, which formalized the ongoing covert rapprochement between Israel and the Gulf countries. And then came last week's lifting of the blockade on Qatar. My reading overall is that regional powers are repositioning themselves before the Biden administration takes office because they're concerned about their mutual relations with Washington as much as the prospect of Biden's embracing a moderate approach to Iran. In this, Turkey's objective, of course, is that with the Biden administration, Turkish-American relations are likely to enter a rough period, and with President Trump gone, now Turkey will be losing leader-to-leader relations, that comfort zone. With normalizing relations with Israel, Ankara is hoping to win Washington's ear again, but of course, assuming only that Israel would be willing to lobby on behalf of Turkey. But I said that is not possible. I don't think that will happen in the short run.
And Galia, does the U.S.-Turkish relationship figure in how Israel responds to Turkey?
I think in general, there's an attempt to understand where Turkey is heading, as I said in my opening remarks. So Turkish-U.S. relations is, of course, a very important litmus test, and the fact that Turkey moved ahead, for example, with the S-400 was very worrying, I think, sign. During Obama time, definitely it was a priority to push Israel and Turkey to repair relations. During the Trump years, there was no effort to have Israel and Turkey on the same page. On the contrary, Trump's actions actually pushed Israel and Turkey even further apart. I just remind the audience that Turkey withdrew its ambassador, and the fact that we have low-level representation is one of the results of the U.S. move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So it remains to be seen what the Biden administration will do. On the one hand, it will resemble in some degree the Obama administration, and there will be benefit to having Turkey and Israel have better relations. On the other hand, if there will be severe tensions in Turkish-U.S. relations, there will be enough on the agenda that not necessarily the Biden administration will also add the Israel-Turkish dimension to it. So I think it remains to be seen. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. I'll be brief on the one that's directed to me. I'm not really a speaker on the panel here today, but how is the Biden administration likely to approach Turkey, and would improved Turkey-Israel ties change that approach in any meaningful way? Look, I think the issues bedeviling U.S.-Turkish relations go well beyond Turkish-Israeli ties. I think it's very hard to move U.S.-Turkish relations forward as long as Turkey continues to possess the S-400s. Congress cares deeply about that issue, has passed even new legislation on it recently. And of course, there are other issues that are likely to come up. There is a pending jurisprudence on the issue of Halkbank, the state-owned bank, which helped Iran circumvent U.S. sanctions. That is going to go forward, unlike under Trump, who tried to block it, although albeit unsuccessfully. Biden will certainly let that go forward. And actually, I believe the next courtroom date is in March. And of course, the issue of US support to the Kurdish group YPG in Northeast Syria, as long as that continues, and I think it is likely to continue under Biden, will remain a very big problem. I don't think any of those issues will be ameliorated by anything, taking into account everything that Celine and Galia have said today is possible in the time to come, including a return of the ambassadors. I don't think that would alter very much the much bigger issues ahead in U.S.-Turkish relations. So moving on, we have a question about whether the Aliyev government could be a diplomatic intermediary between the two, as it has said it wanted to. We've really talked about Azerbaijan. Is there anything else that either of you would like to say on that?
Honestly, if Turkey and Israel really needs Azerbaijani mediation, then things are really grave. I mean, must be really tough. And I mean, the buck on foreign policy issues is on Erdogan, to me. I mean, rather than his advisors, it is Erdogan who decides, who directs foreign policy. And as a charismatic leader who also has all the resources in hand, he has the capacity to control the narrative in Turkey. If tomorrow he comes up and says, now it is time to it is time for reconciliation, I have no doubt that he'll manage to convince his supporters somehow. After all, didn't he say in the wake of the 2016 deal, was I one, did you ask me before setting sail, the Mavi Marmara? I mean, the same thing.
Galia, you said that the reaction in Israel to the talk about a reset and all of that coming from Ankara was quite muted. Do you see Turkey playing any role of consequence in the upcoming Israel elections? And is there any meaningful breakdown within Israel in the parties on their attitude towards Turkey, or are they all more or less have the same attitude at this point?
So yes, you're right. We're heading to the elections in March, and there's no, Turkey is not on the top of the agenda, and unless something dramatic happens, it will not be even a minor issue in the agenda. The agenda is the pandemic, the economics, and of course, Netanyahu's trial. That's what's on the agenda. And also very interestingly, and we can't elaborate a lot about this here because of the time constraints, but basically this is an interesting elections in the sense that it will be a fight within the Israeli right. Usually we had fights between the right and the left, but this time it's going to be in the right. And in this respect, showing being friendly to Turkey is not necessarily something that will be viewed positively by right-wingers. We know Saal, the opponent to Netanyahu, he was actually out of government when the normalization accord was signed in 2016. So he was out of government. He didn't have any responsibility. He was against the agreement, and so he can use this against Netanyahu. So I don't see anything happening unless, again, the Turks will do a major concession, and then Netanyahu.
I see. He actually opposed the 2016 normalization agreement.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the 2016 normalization agreement he opposed. He said he was against it. So. I mean, and it's a weak point with Netanyahu because it didn't fulfill all the expectations, the normalization agreement. Some people use it against him.
I know there are a lot of people in the audience who are interested in Israeli politics. Let me just ask you very briefly, is there on the left in Israeli politics any different attitude than on the right regarding Turkey? I mean, let's say Meretz or what's left of labor, or is there
so there's two actors, Lapid, Yesh Atid. He's been also very anti-Turkish and very pro-recognition of the Armenian genocide and pro-Kurdish. So from him, nothing good also will come for Turkey. But the major opponent coming in the left is now the Tel Aviv mayor, who made a new party, and is the most promising probably party, rising party in the left. And I think he will adopt a more pragmatic view for Turkey. But basically, on the one hand, I mean, it's common among Israelis. They know who Erdogan is. They are mad at him in many respects. But on the other hand, there is this nostalgia for going to Turkey, for the days Turkey-Israeli relations were good, for the Turkish soap operas. I mean, there's also this appeal. The Turkish appeal is still there in some respects.
Isn't it interesting? I mean, Turkey succeeded in bridging the gap between Europe and the United States, and also among the political opposition in Israel, and also, not needless to say, that the countries in the region.
It's been a very unifying force, you're saying, for others. It seems to be the case. Galia, I'm sorry to keep throwing these questions at you, but actually you mentioned the Armenian genocide. And I think Israel, that has been an issue at times in Israel. I don't think the Knesset has ever passed an Armenian genocide resolution, correct? Do you foresee that that could still happen? I mean, the US Congress finally passed one last year. Do you foresee that happening, or is that sort of a bridge too far in relations with Turkey?
There have been growing voices calling for recognition over the years. The issue that has been blocking it in recent times has been actually Israel-Azerbaijan relations, because this is also an issue that Azerbaijan sees as a very sensitive issue and objects to it. So that's been the impediment, the major impediment. Another issue is, I think, and this is not said openly, but I think there is an issue here that the Jews see the Holocaust as something unique. There is, of course, also genocide studies in Israel, and there is recognition of the growing literature on the issue. But at the end of the day, I think it is difficult. It's not a completely easy issue for Israelis, I think.
I know the Armenian sent an ambassador to Israel this year, and then he was recalled at the beginning of the Nagorno-Karabakh fighting. Has he returned yet?
No. He was. It was over the years, Israel-Azerbaijan relations were very good, and Israel-Armenian relations were in the back burner. But and there was a change, and then yes, it was this more pro-Western approach of Armenia, which probably that's why the Russians didn't interfere in the war as they should from Yerevan's perspective, and didn't stop it until it was too late from Yerevan's perspective. So yeah, they sent the ambassador, and after 2 weeks he was recalled because of news about Israel's shipments of armaments to Azerbaijan.
Very interesting. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and maybe I should have said this a couple of minutes ago, but do either of you have any last points that you would like to make? I think we could go a couple of minutes beyond 2 o'clock if necessary. And if not, that's fine. I'll take your silence as eloquent in response. Anyway, I would just say on the last point about nostalgia in Israel, Galia, you reminded me that when I was working at the US House of Representatives, and this was probably around a couple of years after Mavi Marmara, 2 or 3 years, probably 2013, I was sitting with a Turkish diplomat, with an Israeli diplomat, who was not, he had never been posted in Turkey, and he was not somebody who worked on Turkish affairs, but he was an Israeli citizen, and part of the foreign policy establishment, and affected by it. And he said to me kind of wistfully, he said, I really miss the Turks. And it really kind of summed up to me, how Israel felt at that time about Turkey. But I sort of take from what you're saying, Galia, that feeling is not so very widespread anymore in Israel, that it's dissipated greatly. Is that?
I think Israel, it was a bit, the security establishment and the diplomatic establishment was a little bit like an aircraft carrier. It took them time to change direction from having considered Turkey as a very important ally and even a critical ally to Israel. And in order to compensate on the loss of Turkey, Israel had to go to many directions. It had to go to Greece, to Cyprus, to India, to the Gulf countries, to Azerbaijan, to the Balkan states. It had to go to all these countries to compensate on the loss of Turkey. But it did. It did manage to do so. And now these new relationships have a life of their own. So it's difficult to bring the relationship back to where it was. And I think that's a problem. But the usefulness of Turkey is very much there. And I think that's also an issue in Turkish-US relations. You look at Turkey, you look on the map, you see where Turkey is, you wanted to have it on your side. And when you'll do your best to have it. Of course, Turkey has its independent wishes, and you have to see where you can bridge the gaps. But you do want to have Turkey on your side.
And Celine, I took from what you said that whereas Erdogan may see some benefit in reestablishing ties with Israel, resuscitating ties with Israel if he can avoid giving up too much, that there's really not much of a vision for what those ties could be anymore. Is that or is that an overinterpretation of what you've said, or is that accurate? And I'll give this is the last one.
I think even going back to Mavi Marmara would not be that bad, Alan. I mean, it is sustainable. It is a realist bilateral relations. It is a realist basis. I think if only we could go back to that back then, but it is going back to 1990s is impossible, we know, because the geopolitical situation has already changed, you know, but these two countries really have a potential to cooperate, and their cooperation will certainly shift balances in the region too. And I think that will be in the interest of the United States as well. But much depends on how Ankara is going to act, actually. And we'll wait and see, really, if Ankara is sincere in seeking a reset, because you know much of it is also tied to what is going on in domestic politics at the moment. We're going to have an elections, and we know the internal alliance ties between the nationalists and President Erdogan, and the need for reforms, actually, not only mending ties with the West, but they're all one issue is issues are all interlinked. So we're going to wait and see.
And I said this would be my last question to you, but I'm going to ask you one more. It's really yes, no. The one bonding element, the one good thing that remains from the 1990s has been the free trade agreement. And I know trade has gone down a bit in the last couple of years, I think, with COVID.
And whether it is so meaningful is another matter of debate. Yeah.
So that's what I want to ask you. I mean, could you imagine at some point things souring to the point where Turkey breaks that agreement?
No, not really, because the two sides have been very pragmatic in this sense. I mean, they wanted to manage relations when they saw fit, when there is a win-win situation where the situation benefited both sides. They wanted to pursue a pragmatic relationship. That is how they managed to insulate trade relations from political crisis. Otherwise, it wouldn't work that way. But I'm not so sure it's going to remain that way, as I said before.
Thank you. I want to thank both of you, Selin and Galia, for, I think, a very rich discussion. I think we covered a lot of ground, and we really went into a lot of issues in depth. I wish we had more time, but I just ask everyone silently to give a big round of applause, even a silent standing ovation for really what I thought was a terrific discussion. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the moderation. Thank you.
And